Thanks everyone again for joining us here today for this webinar, where we'll be talking about finding aids, right? And some tips that you can hopefully use to start working on basic description for the collections that you work with. So as a quick introduction, I guess I'm here on the screen already, but sometimes presenters are not on the screen. So I threw my picture in there. I'm Kate Philipson. I work as the archive specialist for DHPSNY, and I really love a lot of things about archives and preservation and public history, but description and finding aids are sort of one of my favorite topics. Without it, right, we wouldn't be able to make collections knowable and discoverable and accessible to the public. So I think they're really important, and I'm excited to talk to you about them today. You can also see my intrepid beagle here, Mirabelle, with her own collection that, well, you know, she certainly has spent a lot of time with it, and she knows the ins and outs of all these toys in her collection. I'm not sure she's actually developed a useful finding aid yet, but we can work on it. Maybe she should watch this webinar too. All right, so let's take a quick look first at just what we mean when we talk about archival description. And I'm calling this a review, not because I expect that you necessarily know everything there is to already know about description, but I don't want to cover exactly the same information that was addressed in an earlier DHPSNY webinar. In 2017, my predecessor here at DHPSNY, Amelia Parks, presented and recorded this webinar. You can see the title slide for it on the screen, and it's about finding aid basics. And so I'll encourage you to watch that if it also might be helpful. You can find it on the DHPSNY website where all of our past webinars are listed, and also on our YouTube page. You can subscribe and see new webinar recordings as they're posted. So what is archival description, right? For our purposes today, again, we're just going to look at the very basics to make sure that we have a foundation for the rest of this conversation. So in short, archival description is both the product and the process by which we create a representation and an explanation of archival records. This is the Society of American Archivists definition. And what we're explaining in archival description is a combination of the record's content, structure, and context. So all of this information is important to be able to provide a clear and concise representation and a guide to the collections that you manage. These two principles that you see here on the screen guide both archival arrangement and description, which are fundamentally linked together. So I know this webinar is about description, but it's hard to separate description from arrangement. So we'll just kind of keep that in mind here. Provenance, or sometimes called respective fond in terrible French, states that the records of one person or organization are not to be mixed with records of another person or organization. So this means, right, to the best of your ability, that you should keep records grouped together by their creator as the guiding principle. Additionally, original order deems that you should maintain the organization and sequence of records that was established by the creator of the records. And so while this can sometimes be a really complex and tricky thing to figure out, this principle states that you should strive to maintain the original order of the records in all collections. And so both of these principles help archives and archivists maintain and document both the context and the relationships within and between archival records. So again, as I mentioned, right, arrangement and description are linked together and they reflect one another. So this is just a brief reminder of what we mean when we talk about archival arrangement. It involves these levels which get successively more granular. A collection will likely be, you know, just the records of one creator, like we just talked about, right? A person, a family, or an organization And that is often how you want to arrange a collection, right? Arranging smaller groupings of the materials within a collection takes more time and effort. And frequently, depending on your organization, you will never really arrange anything to an item level. Well, this is a big generalization, especially today, like because we're going to talk about basic description, we're going to stick to the collection level here. And that doesn't mean that you can't or won't eventually arrange and describe materials to a series or a file level, but you'll see why the collection level applies to basic description. Okay, so in addition to this very brief discussion of what archival description is, let's also make sure that we know why we care about doing it at all. I mentioned up front that description is about access, right? Making collections findable and discoverable. So here, the principles for archival description from Describing Archives, a Content Standard, otherwise known as DACS. The principles mimic this, right? Stating that description exists to facilitate the use of archives by people in order to understand the past through traces in records. So there it is, right? Description is for using archives trying to use them to understand history. Additionally, I think to understand history through archival records, we need description to convey how these records and collections represent people, events, and ideas from the past. It's also important, right? I know I mentioned this a lot, but I don't think it hurts to drive home this point that representing people, events, and ideas from the past must focus on the relationships and the context that exist among those people and events and ideas. Essentially, nothing exists in a vacuum. And so archival description has to also reflect the influences that impact people and ideas and the creation of records in order to be the most useful and beneficial. Otherwise, it's hard to make sense of them if we leave out the relationships and the context that are really inherent. Next, this is also a fundamental pillar of understanding archives, that records are arranged, managed, and described in the aggregate. This is part of what makes description important as well, right? And because you never truly like finish if you try to describe every individual item, like we mentioned when we looked at the list of arrangement levels. If you were trying to describe a piece of paper, a diary, a map, a poster, what have you, it's just not practical to do that for every single thing in your archive or your repository. But describing groups of records, right, which relates back again to the collections level on the levels of arrangement slide, groups of records make archives more accessible and understandable. And so lastly, part of the context of any collection is how it got to you, right, to your archival organization. As the archivist, you also have a relationship with the records, and in creating description, in choosing an arrangement, and even in acquiring and accessioning the records in the first place, you've made decisions that impact the collection and its long-term preservation and access. So while I could probably talk about this particular topic all day, for now, we'll just say that archival description is important because it supports the need to document an archivist's own work and interventions with a collection. Okay, so how do we achieve all of these goals and actually create archival description to put out into the world? Well, there are definitely multiple ways to go about this. Description can mean a variety of different things. The core one that we're going to talk about today is finding aids. So these are, very simply put, tools for achieving archival description. A finding aid is a single document that places archival materials in context by consolidating information about the collection. And again, as you can see from this quote on the third bullet point, I took it right from DACS. A finding aid like description helps support users of archives in identifying and accessing the materials that they're looking for. A finding aid can also be created using a combination of things, but first, right, it uses these 25 defined elements that make up DACS, describing archives as a content standard. And so we'll talk about some of those, the required elements, in a little bit. You don't need to stress about knowing really or using all 25, but creating a finding aid should also be guided by the set of principles of archival description in DACS, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later, and how these principles, right, help shape the archival description that you write. And of course, the finding aid must also serve your organization, its specific needs, and its users. So what goes into writing the finding aid will in part be determined by your unique institutional circumstances as well. Okay, right, so all of this information is to frame the core of why we're here. We want to create some basic archival description. So we're going to talk first about the why, again, of creating archival description that is more simple than it is complex and detailed. And then we'll look at how to get started doing that. Right, so here is a lot of what basic description affords you. I'm sorry for the busy slide here. I just really appreciate all of these researchers in 1915, New York State room of regents surrounded by piles of paper. But I was trying with this image to visually get across that when you invest in basic description, you can more quickly and easily get to a point of providing access to all of the archival holdings in your collection. This is, to providing all of the archival holdings within your organization. So all the different collections, right? This is not only a part of the DACS principles, encouraging you to provide access to everything, but it really helps you and it helps users to draw more connections across different materials and across different collections. In part, for the archivist, this can allow you to see what materials are most popular and useful to researchers, and it can in turn help guide future decisions for the organization, such as what topics and types of materials to acquire. Additionally, basic description will serve you in something that I think is really important to keep in mind when doing this work, and that is that you really want your description to guide researchers. You don't have to draw them a directly representational map. Guiding description explains the collections rather than just mimics them. So in the words of Maureen Callahan, which we'll provide a link to her blog post afterwards, this blog post was written from a talk that she gave in 2014 about archival description, where she talks about this idea of maps versus guides and how finding aids should evaluate rather than represent records. Also, while all description should include these qualities that you see in the third column there, I'm going to highlight them as some core points of basic description. It should be flexible, scalable, and interoperable, meaning, right, that your description is technically output neutral. So using DACS sort of builds these qualities into archival description. But I think it's important to keep in mind as you work on creating description is that basic description leaves you a space for further iteration of more description in the future. So this is just a part of the DACS principle. Again, I think the principles in large part support everything we're talking about in creating basic description here. So I just wanted to highlight this one. I think it sort of sums up this why question and pushes for creating basic description. You want to strive for basic description so that everything actually has description. It serves so many archival stewardship needs, like what we just talked about, right? Access to a better, broader sense of the scope of your holdings, and the ability for archivists to gather information about how collections are used. So, okay, this part is going to get a little more nitty-gritty into the details of DACS and how it works as a guiding tool for creating finding aids. And then we'll take a look at some examples of how some of these details like play out and what it looks like in a finding aid. So first, I'll just reiterate something that I think was already mentioned. And if it wasn't, I apologize. There's no proper level of description. Archivists must understand the needs of their organization and use their own judgment to determine what is best for them. So DACS discusses two different ways to write archival description, either at a single level or with a multi-level hierarchical structure. This multi-level description means that you're describing materials at more than one level of arrangement, which we talked about earlier, right? Say at the collection level, and then you're also writing description for the series level of the same collection. So this gets more complicated to talk about, and we're going to stick with the basic path, right? The single level. So put a star there just so you know that's what we're talking about here. And we're going to keep our description right on this single collection-based level. Also, sort of as a framing device, DACS discusses these three different categories of description, right? Which all of the 25 elements fit within. And you can certainly use all 25 if you really wanted to, but most of the time that's unnecessary, and it's definitely not simple. So, well, clearly, right, the minimum baseline requirements of elements to use in your finding aid is the simplest. These are successive, right? Minimum, optimum builds on that, and then added value adds even more on top of the minimum and optimum levels. We're going to recommend and sort of talk about the minimum and then the optimum level. Just the optimum includes just two more elements, and because of what those elements are, and because of a little, it just doesn't take that much more work than the minimum level. So it's a small amount of work to add on the optimal level, and it can provide a lot more support for users. It can also save you time and effort in the future for working with collections descriptions. So that is, again, that's why that one is starred. But we'll take a quick look at what is required when you combine the minimum and optimum elements for single level description. And again, this is all in DACS. So I'm trying to like summarize and bring here the easiest elements of what's going on, but this information is all findable in the written standard. So DACS, right, where are we here? This is when you combine these two levels. Here are the 10 elements I mentioned that are required at the minimum level. So in order to allay any confusion, I'll mention that the numbers you see here, right, in parentheses after the name of the element, these are just how the elements are listed and described in different chapters in DACS. So the first number is the number of the chapter. You don't really need to keep this in mind. Again, it's all kind of written clearly in DACS, but each chapter is just different categories of elements. And you should be able to see that most of these elements are pretty basic information, right? DACS helps you to structure what to write for these within the standard, so it's helpful to look at, but they're really relatively flexible for what your collection needs. I want to point out just two of these elements because one is sort of the most important to understand. They're all important, but I don't need to sort of tell you how to pull out the dates from your collection necessarily, but I do want to talk about scope and content first. This is element 3.1, and when writing this part of archival description right here is where you'll talk about the materials in the collection and the information included within those materials. So it's just sort of important to keep in mind, right, that here you want to provide an overview of the collection contents and the types of materials presented, the formats, and you also want to mention the activities and processes that happen to these records, like how did they get created in the first place? And it's also worth mentioning, right, who is essential to the description of this collection, to these records, the people, the places, the activities, topics, other events that are documented within the materials. Sometimes it's also really helpful to talk about what the strengths and weaknesses of the collection are, and what you might expect to find that isn't there in the materials. If it's someone, you know, famous for playing basketball and you don't have any of their basketball history in your collection, and what you might not expect it is there, say that person famous for playing basketball has a bunch of records about the few years they played baseball. You might not necessarily expect that in their sort of overall recorded collections of their own personal history, but there it is, there's some baseball too. So just make sure that in this you take the information from the materials themselves and you're not elaborating too much. The other element that I wanted to point out, this rights statement for archival description, is because it's pretty new. It was just adopted into DACS this year in 2021. And this element identifies the conditions under which the archival description itself is available for use and reuse. Repositories should establish a consistent policy about the rights granted. If a formal license is used, this element should include both the source of the license and the institutional policies governing the type of license chosen. So that language is a little technical. Basically, it's saying there really aren't that many examples out there yet, either of this element in use in finding aids, but it's saying that you want to state in your finding aid if the information that you've written in your finding aid is reproducible and usable by other folks. There are different licenses for that under sort of copyright heading, right? So you can see two different examples here on the slide, one for a specific finding aid and one that you might write on every finding aid for every collection because it applies wholesale to the entire repository. Just worth keeping in mind as you consider description work moving forward. And then finally, right here are the two extra elements that are in the optimum category for description that we're recommending you incorporate into basic description. I still think this information, while not fully required by DACS, is really key and still a part of basic description. So there's the administrative and biographical history, which helps identify the creator of the records, whether it's a person or family. Usually call that the biographical history, or if the creator of the collection is an institution or organization, a business. What you write, then we call that the administrative history. And you can see how this element is key to understanding so much of the context of how records are created, right? You can include information about relationships here between the creators themselves and also the relationship between the creator and the materials. And this helps you start to develop and get out that essential context that I keep bringing up. Second, right, access points is its own really large topic. that's really interesting, and we're going to gloss over it here. But suffice it to say for now that for basic description, it's still really helpful to include these in your finding aid. An access point is a name, term, etc., by which a descriptive record may be searched and identified in order to facilitate access and retrieval. Again, so we see the purpose there, right, is providing as much access as possible to these materials. These are often created using catalogs of terms, right, such as subjects or name headings, types of materials, like the format, and they have sort of one set like descriptive meaning in these catalogs, the sources, and they can be really helpful for researchers who are looking to connect collections materials. So one example is the Library of Congress subject headings. You can pull access points from there. Let's see. Before we look at the examples, I'll just talk quickly about how we take all of this information about DACS elements, right, and work to ensure that we can do this type of basic description. First, right, you can use the documentation that you already have about your collections. You can gather information from accession documents, or maybe someone did an inventory at some point before you got there, right? So there's other materials that might give you some useful information about your collection. Feel free to use all that, right? Ensure, of course, that like accession policies are in place to like record the accessioning info as you are accessioning. If you're there taking in new collections, that can help you or anyone else moving forward with description. I will also make a little plug for processing plans. I presented another webinar, a DHPSNY webinar last year about processing plans, which you can go find. It has some overlapping information here, but I think they're really useful for either, you know, your prioritized collections or for all of your collections. And also, you know, standardize the presentation and display of your descriptive information. Having a template can just help you build in this work in a way that makes it more easy to manage moving forward. Software tools exist for this. A lot of people use archive space that helps provide a consistent structure already for these DACS elements, but also a word processing program can provide you with something similar for your own organization. It can still be flexible. You can have built in there kind of just what you need. Also, having a template or something consistent helps enhance recognition and understanding by users. So it helps you as the archivist create the description, and it can help folks and researchers and users to understand it. Okay, so I believe Leah is going to put in the chat for us some links to these finding aids. I just have, you know, these slides might not be the easiest to read, so they're going to be in the chat window, the links to these. I just have screenshots of the finding aids up here, so hopefully it's not too tough to see, but you can follow along on your browser if you have a browser window open. So to start with, right, these two finding aids, the first one is called the School in Rose Valley records. There's not a ton to talk about here, but I just wanted you to notice that all the elements that we saw a few slides ago are visible. Something additional here on this first page is the abstract, which is really just a front page summary of the other descriptive elements. So it's not creating new information, and it isn't completely required, but it's helpful for any researcher who is browsing collections. Here is the historical note for the same finding aid, right? We get a lot of information about the organization, the school in Rose Valley, and its history. And also I don't have a pointer, but here a little bibliography too about where this information came from. So it wasn't just created out of thin air. Really helpful to have those kinds of citations in your finding aid. Here is the scope and contents. Again, this talks about the records in the collection, right? It lists them out. We know when the bulk of materials are from. We know the full scope of the dates, and we know that there's administrative and financial records, teaching materials, student publications, types of audiovisual materials, and all sorts of stuff that document the experiences of these students and faculty and families that are associated with the school. So this isn't the full thing, and we don't need to read through it here, but I just want you to get a sense of what goes into the scope and contents element. Lastly are the controlled access headings. Again, you can see how some of these subjects and geographic names might be able to help researchers connect the core like topics and places of one collection with something else. If they were studying progressive education, this part of the finding aid might help them research further organizations that were related to progressive education. So here is a guide to the Nelson Cross papers from the Brooklyn Historical Society. I just highlighted the title to make it stand out a little bit. You can see the repository, name and address. Who worked on this collection is great to add on. Who worked on this description on creating this finding aid? Awesome to get to add in there if you can. When the finding aid was published, and also that it is using English and using DACS, everything we've been talking about. I do want to call out that you take a quick look at the quantity also, right? This is called extent in DACS, that's the word for it, but it's very small. And I think it's important to note that even a small collection can receive basic description in the aggregate, right? At the collection level, you might look at this and say, oh, there's only 3 folders. We can describe all these folders, or we can describe all of the items in these folders. That's still going to take you a really long time. And it's just, worth knowing that you can still describe in the aggregate a pretty simple amount of information, right? We have an understanding of who Nelson Cross is here. We can see what materials are in the collection, how he's related to the Brooklyn Historical Society in some ways. And then you can also see the access points. There's more of them here. This guy was all over the place. Just a variety of information that helps make this finding aid, again, more accessible, more findable, more useful for researchers. And lastly, I wanted to point out this administrative information at the end. It has our required conditions governing access note, which is great that it's open and accessible without restriction. And it also has a processing information note. So this is what we were just talking about, right? This collection is minimally processed at the collection level. It's kind of nice to know that the archivist went in with that intention when they created this description. So we're going to touch a little bit on DACS itself as a content standard and as a part of the archival field and what it does for archival description, how it's managed, and also why it changes. That's one of the things I was interested in sort of exploring here, just because you could look at it and find something frustrating about this large tome of information if you aren't thinking about how it's broken down. So this just helps me sort of put it in a little bit more context as a thing that we use as archivists. So some key moments, right? DACS has existed since 2004. It was first released and sort of meant to align with other archival standards and help build out those standards for use in the US. Canada does use a different type of description content standard. In 2016, I know there's a big gap in there. There was some other things that happened, but nothing super essential. In 2016, the structure for sort of accessing and updating DACS moved to a platform called GitHub Online, and it's sort of an open source software development platform most of the time, but it's sort of allowed the archivists who manage DACS to build in things like a versioning system, a change log. It sort of made it more accessible to archivists on a rolling basis. The versioning system is also great. That's sort of been in place so that you can see what all the changes in the structure of DACS have looked like. Mostly they're really small little changes, sometimes some wording stuff or some debugging in the GitHub structure where you can see it. But when there's a bigger change, that's also noted in the change log. Excuse me. In 2019, also we got these new principles. They were developed and released as an updated version of DACS. And I think they say a lot about the pushing forward the sort of theory and structure of the field, right? There's been a lot of different kinds of conversations in the archival field about what description can do, who archives are for, and I think the new principles help reflect a lot of those updated conversations and theoretical writings and help put them into practice. Also, just again, in 2021, I mentioned that new element was added in there, the rights statements for archival description. And again, that's related to transparency and making sure that archival description is sort of usable as data in some ways. You can see at the bottom here, I just kind of want to point out overall, DACS is ever changing, and it's changing in order to align it with related standards and updated archival theory. I think it's helpful to know who manages this standard, right? Who takes care of it. It's maintained by the Society of American Archivists Technical Subcommittee on Describing Archives Content Standard, right? So the technical subcommittee of DACS, they respond to feedback from the archival community on the whole. People submit ideas, and that is sort of the first step of the process of how revisions are made. But revisions are a formal process. They go through a lot of different steps and must ultimately be approved by the SAA Council. And right, of course, I skipped the third one, but the subcommittee communicates information about DACS to the archival community. That's just part of their responsibilities. And so the last thing I just wanted to touch on, because I think it's a great update, right? This is the front cover of the 2019 update to DACS. It's sort of the PDF that is published. So if you download the PDF, you're getting the 2019 version, but this was published because it has a major update to the principles. And again, this kind of, I know I just mentioned this a little bit, but the principles are intended to provide a theoretical grounding for the rules of archival description that follow in the rest of the DACS standard. I think this is really important and useful, right? We have this theoretical grounding and we can apply it to all of the archival description that we work through. And here's really, these aren't, I didn't want to write out all the principles because again, you can go see them in DACS, you can read each one of them, but these are the key points that I think the technical subcommittee sort of developed. There's a larger committee of folks that developed these new principles, and they focus on, you know, making sure that description is user-centered and accessible. You know, if what this means for you, I think everyone should be thinking really with some focus about what their description, what their users need, and how description can best serve users, as well as making sure it, you know, guides users through collections accurately. The principles also sort of ask us to document archival interventions and archivist knowledge on the collections. This is built into some of the elements, and really important to be thinking about how we represent our own work and our own understanding of collections, where that information comes from, right? Can be displayed in something as easy as the citations that we looked at, but also sort of stating what you've done, what kind of work you've done on a collection, what you know about it, and also maybe what you don't know about it is worth being clear about upfront in your descriptive content. The principles, mentioned this before too, right? But they strive to sort of ensure that description is continuous and iterative, and that it's responsive and flexible to different needs, changing user bases, and changing goals of the organization, right? Not to say that you should just go wholesale, start over from scratch and write new description every time you might update your mission statement, which hopefully you aren't doing too often anyway. But it's important to keep in mind that you can revisit description, right? It's flexible enough and should be responsive enough to updated theory and understanding of what we want to do with description, that you can revisit it and work through it again to make sure that it's still useful. Descriptive rules apply equally to all records and all formats. This was very much taken from the older set of principles, and it just says that no matter what types of materials you're describing and working with, the descriptive rules in DACS that you see can apply the same over all of those. So it's really format neutral. Again, here, my favorite part to point out, contextual significance through relationships. This is always something we want to strive to be documenting. If you're not, I encourage you to revisit your description and what your description looks like, but thinking about the relationships in the materials that you're talking about, and the relationships of the materials to the creator, and also the relationship, again, of you, the archivist, to the materials too, and how you've intervened, what you've worked on, if you've changed the arrangement. All of those things are essential to the context. And lastly, right, this description, this concept of description as data, right? We want to be able to use it and reuse it and share it and make it more accessible across the field. So I think keeping these things in mind and these parts of the principles in mind can really go a long way as you think about basic description and what creating sort of basic description and moving through descriptive work can do for your collections. So I think that is it for this overall presentation. I know I'm pretty sure it's up on the website now. We'll take some questions now if anyone has questions, but I will encourage you to also mark your calendars for September 22nd if you'd like to join us again. We're going to do a full Q&A session, so no presentation. We're just going to take questions, talk with folks about their own challenges and questions they have in producing finding aids in the description that they're working on. So with that said, here's some contact information for DHPSNY, and I really appreciate everyone for being here. So thank you.